Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
We're looking at a situation right now that it feels like it's been pulled straight from a history book. A really sustained, intense U.S. pressure campaign aimed squarely at a major Latin American nation.
It's a level of escalation we just haven't seen in decades.
The facts on the ground are pretty stark. As of late 2025, we're talking about roughly 25% of the entire U.S. Navy stationed just off the coast of Venezuela.
That's a massive deployment.
It is. And you couple that with really hostile rhetoric, naval blockades, and we have confirmed reports of the military blowing up ships they allege are drug boats. So the big question looming over all of this is, what are the real motivations here? What's driving this aggression against the Maduro regime?
Right.
And that's what this deep dive is for you. We've gone through a whole stack of sources, geopolitical analyses, investigative reports, government statements from both sides, to try and unpack the multi-layered and frankly often conflicting reasons behind U.S. policy. We're going to try and cut through the noise.
And to start, you have to understand that U.S. policy isn't just one thing. It's really built on 5 key pillars.
Okay.
They're all intertwined. You've got economic needs, strategic goals, ideology. It's all focused on, redefining American influence in the region.
So what are the 5?
We're going to look at oil and resources, geopolitics, the push for democracy and human rights, counter-narcotics, which is the big public one, and then, of course, migration and the need for regional stability.
Okay, let's unpack that. Starting with the one that seems, inescapable. The economy. Oil. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. Not just a lot, the largest. That fact alone puts it on the radar of any global power, right?
It creates this sort of gravitational pull. And it's not just potential, it's historical. Reasserting U.S. access to that energy is, without a doubt, a quiet primary objective. I mean, you have to remember, American firms had huge stakes there before the nationalizations back in the 70s.
Right.
So there's this deep multi-decade desire to regain control or at least privileged access to that immense wealth.
Okay, the resource gravity is clear. So let's move to the official reason, the one that gets the most press for the naval buildup. Counter-narcotics.
Yes, the official pretext. The U.S. has been very public about this, framing it as a direct threat to national security.
And this is the justification for the blockades, the tanker seizures, all of it.
Exactly. And woven into that is the ideological part, the goal of promoting democracy against a regime the U.S. sees as, illegitimate and criminal.
Which connects directly to the huge humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a major regional destabilizer, isn't it?
A massive one, absolutely. Stabilizing Venezuela is now critical for regional order, mainly because of the refugee crisis. We're talking an estimated 8 million refugees over the past decade.
8 million. That number is it's hard to even comprehend.
It is. And that puts an unbelievable strain on its neighbors, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador.
Yeah.
Their politics, their social services are being fundamentally altered. So for the U.S., stopping that flow isn't just an idea, it's a direct regional stability priority.
And then the final piece, the big picture, the global chess game, geopolitics. For years, Venezuela has been a kind of strategic outpost for U.S. rivals.
Correct. So there's a clear U.S. goal to counter the influence of Russia, China, and Iran. Venezuela gives them a convenient foothold in the Western Hemisphere, and that alone makes it strategically important, regardless of its oil or its government. It's about blocking rivals.
So that's the U.S. rationale, a complex mix. But if we flip the page in our sources, the Venezuelan government, they see this very, very differently.
Completely differently. Maduro's narrative is simple and uncompromising. It's warmongering, it's colonialism. And what's really interesting is how former President Trump handed him the perfect soundbite for this.
You're talking about that quote, Maduro jumped all over.
I am. Maduro pointed directly to a statement from Trump where he said the military pressure would continue until Venezuela gave back the oil, land, and other assets that they previously stole from us. For Maduro, that was complete vindication. He basically said, see, it's not about democracy, it's about ownership. He called it the diplomacy of barbarism.
That's a powerful counter-narrative, and it brings us back to that counter-narcotics pretext. How well does that hold up when you really look at it?
It's difficult to sustain under scrutiny. I mean, yes, drug trafficking is a real problem there, but Venezuela is mostly a transit route for cocaine that's processed in Colombia. And that cocaine, it's overwhelmingly headed for Europe, not the United States.
And what about fentanyl? That's the other big one we hear about.
And that's even more disconnected. Fentanyl largely originates from Mexico, made with precursor chemicals from China. So the idea that this massive naval force is there to stop a direct drug threat to American streets, it's questionable.
And the experts in our sources go even further. They suggest the threat from Venezuelan criminal networks is, and I'm quoting here, constructed and not actual, exaggerated for political reasons.
Right. We hear a lot about two groups, Tren de Aragua and the so-called Cartel de los Soles.
So let's break those down.
Tren de Aragua is a genuinely nasty transnational criminal gang. No question. It started in Venezuela. It has spread. But there's no real evidence it's being directed by Maduro or that it's systematically invading the U.S.
Okay, and the other one, the Cartel of the Suns.
Cartel de los Soles. This is probably the most misunderstood part. The U.S. narrative is that Maduro himself heads this cartel. But the expert consensus is that Cartel de los Soles is more of a convenient umbrella term.
What do you mean?
It refers to a collection of high-ranking officials, mostly military generals, who are corrupt. They take bribes to facilitate cocaine transit. It's not a cartel with a central command structure like you'd see in Mexico.
And the name itself, Cartel of the Suns, where does that come from?
That's the key detail. The soles, or suns, are the gold sun insignias on the shoulders of Venezuelan generals. The name itself implies it's not some separate group, but corruption within the very top of the armed forces. It's a system, not a syndicate. That nuance gets lost, but it's critical.
That reframing really changes the picture. Okay, so if the drug narrative is shaky, what else could be driving this level of pressure? Some of our sources point to a neighbor, Cuba.
This is fascinating. You can almost map U.S. policy directly onto the political priorities of certain influential figures, like Senator Marco Rubio. His anti-communist platform seems to link U.S. policy directly to harming the Cuban government by cutting off its main lifeline.
So this massive strategic deployment could be, in part, about squeezing Havana. Is there data on that?
There is very specific data. It's estimated that U.S. sanctions have managed to cut off about 50,000 barrels of oil per day that would have gone from Venezuela to Cuba.
Wow.
Venezuela has been Cuba's economic life support since the Soviet Union collapsed. So if you want to choke Havana, cutting that flow is a primary goal. And that seems to be a major, if unstated, driver for the hardliners.
And of course, it's not just Cuba. Venezuela is this nexus point for other U.S. rivals. How deep are those ties with China, Russia, Iran?
They're very deep, and that's the concern. China is Venezuela's biggest creditor. They're owed something like $60 billion, often paid back with oil. So if Maduro falls, China's $60 billion investment is suddenly at risk.
And Russia?
Russia is the long-standing defense partner.
Yep.
They supplied the Sukhoi fighter jets that are the backbone of Venezuela's air force. And Iran is getting more involved, helping with transportation, technology, all in exchange for resources, which helps both countries get around sanctions.
So that all feeds into the theory that this is just the U.S. reasserting the Monroe Doctrine, right? Drawing a line in the sand in its backyard.
That theory is definitely out there. But a lot of experts we looked at argue the threat is overstated. The country has declined into what they call failed state status. It is not, they stress, Cuba 1962.
Meaning Russia and China wouldn't actually step in.
The thinking is that neither has a strong enough stake, or frankly, the ability to intervene militarily if the regime collapses. China might even quietly welcome a change if it meant they had a better chance of getting their money back.
Okay, let's circle back to the biggest prize, the oil. If that's the goal, why this incredibly high-risk military path?
And that is the most important strategic question here. Many analysts argue oil is actually a marginal factor in this specific escalation.
How can that be?
Because there are two ways to get the oil.
Okay.
Path one, overthrow Maduro, install a friendly government, and then spend billions to rebuild the shattered oil industry. High risk, high cost.
And path two?
Path two is much simpler. Establish diplomatic relations with the current regime, lift sanctions, and just buy the oil on the open market. Venezuela is desperate to sell it. The fact the U.S. is choosing path one, the military path, suggests something else is the primary driver. Geopolitics, ideology, the migration crisis. Something else is pushing the needle.
So what about the Venezuelan people themselves? There's massive support for change, we know that. But how do they feel about U.S. intervention?
It's incredibly complicated. You can see from the support for the opposition candidate, Edmundo González Urrutia, that a huge majority, maybe 70%, desperately wants Maduro gone. They want change. But that same majority overwhelmingly dislikes the idea of a foreign military intervention. They don't want to see foreign boots on the ground. There's a deep historical fear of interference. They want the change to come from within.
And yet the military pressure continues. So what does this aggressive strategy actually achieve?
It changes the calculus for Maduro's inner circle. That's the key. The constant, credible threat of removal, or worse, forces them to think about self-preservation. It makes exile to Russia or Turkey look more appealing. Or it could provoke a coup, a split within the regime itself. It's designed to create fractures at the very top.
But the day after, the risk of that must be immense.
That's what keeps analysts up at night. The U.S. has never invaded a country the size of Venezuela in South America. It's a fragile state, full of armed non-state groups. You have gangs, Colombian rebels like the ELN, and then you have the colectivos.
What are the collectivos?
They're government-backed paramilitary groups, heavily armed, fiercely loyal to the regime. They're a massive wild card. An intervention wouldn't just be against an army. It would be against this fragmented, insurgency-prone landscape. And we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan what happens when you don't have a plan for the day after.
A very messy situation.
A very high risk of backfiring and creating total chaos.
So, to wrap up this deep dive, it's clear U.S. policy isn't about just one thing. It's this complex web. You have resource desire, geopolitical moves against Russia and China, ideological opposition, and the very real need to manage a refugee crisis, all layered with the personal politics of people in Washington.
It's exactly that mix that makes it so unpredictable. And it leads me to a final thought for our listeners to think about. Let's say it works. Let's say Maduro is removed. You still have 8 million refugees around the world. What has to happen inside Venezuela, beyond just removing one man, to make the country stable and attractive enough for those millions of people to actually come home? What does a strong Venezuelan state even look like to a generation that has only known collapse?
A profound question, and one that hangs over everything as the pressure keeps mounting. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
It was a pleasure to unpack it all.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.